We have to start now. And it's a pleasure. My name is Denis Boulot. I am from France, and I'm the president of the French Association of Aerosol Research. And it's my pleasure today to introduce our plenary speaker, Professor Gunther Obert-Doster. And I say a few words extract from the short bibliography in the website. So we have to know that for more than 35 years, he has studied effect on underlying mechanisms of lung injury induced by inhaled compounds of environmental and occupational relevance. I have to point out and underline that the results from his laboratory in the beginning of the 90s were the first to point out the potential of ambient ultrafine to cause adverse effects. He introduced the ultrafine particle hypothesis, and at the same time, he pointed out the propensity of nano-sized particles to travel to secondary organs and proposed the importance of particle surface area as the most important dosimetric. He is author of more than 300 papers on book chapter, and I think it's the right person to introduce the conference on toxicology and risk assessment of airborne nano-sized particles. Plus, Gunther.
Thank you very much, Dennis. And most of all, thank you very much, Roberta, and the organizers for having invited me to present some data here. It's actually the second time that I'm at the EAC conference. First time was some years ago in Dublin. I don't know how long ago, but it was a nice conference as well. And I saw here we have lots of presentations. I yesterday enjoyed the health session, and we had some interesting discussions right there. So I will be talking about toxicology and risk assessment of airborne nano-sized particles, which is, of course, somewhat my field of expertise. And I start here with a slide showing from the International Agency for Research and Cancer, where they came up with the conclusion that outdoor air pollution is a leading environmental cause of cancer deaths in humans. And they grouped then outdoor air pollution as a group 1 known human carcinogen, and that there's sufficient evidence. A year before, they had already found or decided that diesel engine exhaust, and that the old traditional diesel engine exhaust is also a known human carcinogen, group 1 carcinogen. And of course, diesel exhaust consists a lot of ultrafine particles. Going to the next slide. This shows you a really idealized, typical urban size distribution here, 4-modal size distribution. And you see here, of course, the ultrafine size here from below 0.1, so 100 nanometers here, consisting of the nucleation mode and the Aitken mode. And it's interesting, just 3 weeks ago, a paper was published here by Peters et al., where they looked at blood pressure and same-day exposure in school children. And they found then a significant association specifically with nano-sized particles. And for the bigger particles here, there is not much of an effect here. But you see the smaller the particles become, the more significant that is here, specifically if they go to the 20 to 30 nanometer sizes, as indicated in this slide here. Interesting also is a study from 2007 from Oranko et al. They looked at ambient size distribution when they did on-road diesel exhaust measurements, and found here that the particles below 10 nanometers, very sensitive here, below 10 nanometers had a significant number concentration here. Look, when they used the thermodenuter to get rid of the volatile components as shown here. And they are, of course, hard to measure here. There is recent evidence also by Howe and Graham in a study here where they looked at fly ash particles here, and you see the big silica alumina fly ash particle here, and on top of that, soot-like carbon deposits consisting of 5 to 25 nanometer nanoparticles. And they looked at it with high-resolution imagery and found that this is a fragile network of carbon soot with individual fullerenes. The next slide, it shows you here actually one fullerene here sticking. It's very sensitive. One fullerene sticking out there. And this brings me then to the issue of engineered nanoparticles here. And of course, you all know they're in the range of approximately 100 to 1 nanometer here, consisting of very different materials, and there are constantly new materials being developed here. A lot of, for example, fullerenes, including graphenes also. And what I like to point out here, when nanoparticles, when the ultrafine hypothesis, specifically also engineered nanoparticles, were toxicologically first investigated as such in the 1990s, there was immediately a lot of concern about their potential hazard. And I like to describe that here in this hype cycle of nanotoxicology, where there was immediately a high increase in the hazard potential, assumed hazard potential, such that it was thought all nanoparticles are really toxic here. And at the culmination, that goes then slowly back to return to scientific thinking here, an appreciation of the reality here, and ending up in a realistic assessment of hazard and risk here. So that's where we are hopefully today here. But to give you some idea what at the time has been discussed in the popular press, nanoparticles kill workers, they cause cancer, damage DNA, soften your brain in one publication in Germany, and on it goes here. So in total, they are cute little assassins. And I get from time to time emails such as this one here. I read about your work online. Please, can you advise me? I'm considering buying a Panasonic electric shaver. The blades are polished with nanoparticles. Would this be a potential health risk? And you can see that the general population, really, at least some of them, are really concerned about the risk of nanoparticles in general. And this is then based also on many, many scientific publications. I list here one of those. And this was a study, and that was highlighted as a landmark study where nanotitanium dioxide was instilled intranasally into mice. And then what the investigators observed is there were significant inflammatory responses in the brain of those animals. And if you look, though, at the doses that were used, nano-TI2, 7.5 milligram into a mouse, which is equivalent to 17.5 grams into a human nose. And 17.5 grams is something like this here. And you can imagine, and these are the studies, and we still get publications like this all over, in vitro studies as well as in vivo studies. We need to be really very, very careful. Specifically here in this case, we are dealing with instillation. That means that in a fraction of a second, the whole dose is administered, in this case intranasally. And I like to use a slide pointing out what it means here. And you see on the left the same dose delivered at a low dose rate, and at the right dose equivalent to instillation, the whole dose is given at once. And certainly you will have a dramatic effect, as you can well imagine here. Bill Slicker, he published a study about 10 years ago already, where he pointed out that either the dose is, or the mechanism that is initiated by a certain dose in toxicology depends highly on the dose, of course, and the normal human exposure range down on the left side here is where we would like to get some data. But what's typically used in toxicology studies are high doses, really high doses. And that, of course, means that we are saturating certain metabolic enzyme, certain binding sites, receptors, and transporter proteins in general, saturating defense mechanism, and the mechanisms that are underlying these high dose responses are certainly not operating at low realistic relevant doses here. And that's what we have to consider here, that the dose really makes also the mechanism. Not only the dose makes the poison, as we know since Paracelsus, 1600, but the mechanism as well. And we have to be careful how to use the data and extrapolate that to the human condition. Come back to International Agency for Research on Cancer with respect to carbon nanotubes evaluation, and they found in animals sufficient evidence for a specific kind, the multi-wall carbon nanotube 7 or mid-series 7 nanotubes, for carcinogenicity, limited for other multi-wall nanotubes, and inadequate for single-wall carbon nanotubes. So the classification for humans then was a group 2B, possibly carcinogenic for these multi-wall carbon nanotube 7, and not classifiable for other material, for other multi-wall nanotubes, because there are not just not enough data there. So this is where we stand at the moment, but I come back to that later on here. What you keep in mind, though, is that we've seen not any nanospecific disease, which is of course a good thing, that we are careful. And there is no new pathophysiological mechanism of injury. We know already the body can only respond in so many ways, and so there's nothing new in any kind of injury that is induced by nanomaterials here. Of course, the mechanisms of biodistribution, they are different, and I come back to that. And we have, I mentioned already, lots of traditional in vitro and in vivo studies, and they have never really considered, well, I shouldn't say never, but they have rarely considered the dose issue, which is such an important one for toxicology. And we need to consider experimental doses compared to real-world exposures. And then also with respect to progress in safety assessment, it's a slow progress, and results are often questionable. So we still have a lot of things to do. Coming back to the hype cycle, over time there was an increasing realization about the critical importance of physicochemical characteristics of engineered nanomaterials. And I list some here, which materials that are really important and affect the hazard potential or toxicity of nanomaterials. Here is the size, distribution, shape, agglomeration, aggregation, state, density, and so on. But most important, I think, are surface properties, the area, the charge, the reactivity in particular of the surface, and certain chemistries, coatings and contaminants, and also defects on surface all play important roles. I think the surface is a key issue here to consider. And of course, these properties can change how nanomaterials are produced, how they are prepared, and how they are stored, and also when introduced into the organism, into physiological media, they certainly change then, and that all changes also how they might interact at a subcellular level here. The same thing is true throughout the life cycle of nanomaterials from the cradle to the grave, basically, that they may change in terms of their physicochemical characteristics here. So in general, then, what is different about airborne nano-sized particles? First of all, and you of course know quite well, there's a large number and surface area per volume or per mass, which means a potential for greater reactivity, specifically reactive oxygen species or particle-bound reactive oxygen species, more surface atoms or molecules per mass. The deposition in the respiratory tract occurs by diffusion, and I come back to that later. And all regions of the respiratory tract are really targeted. Normally it's thought the smaller the particles, the deeper they penetrate into the lung. It's not quite true, as we will show shortly. And then the disposition and biokinetics, that is the translocation of nanomaterials across cell barriers into cells and interacting with subcellular structures, very important. Also the translocation along axons and dendrites of neurons, which does not occur with larger particles here. So here this shows briefly, which is easy to understand, the increased percentage of surface molecules with decreasing particle size here, meaning the increased catalytic activity. And we, as many others, of course, are also looking at the particle-bound reactive oxygen species and determining then those in cell-free assays here. example here is with different carbon materials, carbon particles of different sizes, different origins. There is a material from the Palace generator, I'm sure you are familiar with that. And then Silvercarb, a bigger one, 300 nanometer particle, Printex 90, and others. And if we did these measurements where the activity is expressed as hydrogen peroxide equivalence on the left axis here, and there you see there's a wide spread here of activities depending on the source of the particles, the type of particles, the size of particles, of all carbon particles. But if you express this same data in terms of surface area, then they all fall close together, as you can see here, again pointing out the importance of surface area reactivity. We did also in Rochester, and point out here also a very old study from Vernon Timbrell in 1988, and there was no big discussion about surface area, but he correlated the asbestos miners in South Africa from different mines, the appearance of fibrotic responses in the lung, the grade of fibrotic responses with either the mass and number of surface area of the retained asbestos fibers. And here again you see expressing this correlation by surface area shows a very nice significant relationship for surface area all over these 6 different mines that he has used in this study here. So coming back to RS activities, in Rochester, in our particle center, and we were working together with Dr. Hopke, who is also in the audience here, to look at the RS particle bound RS activity on ultrafine particles. And here you can see over a year the differences for different regions, for different seasons here of RS activities expressed again as equivalence of hydrogen peroxide here. And when we looked then at the correlation between number concentration and RS activity, you see here the number concentration, yes, there is some variation, but overall it's pretty even over the time here in this short period here. But there was a peak of RS activities, as you can see here, despite the same number concentration. So there is no really always a good correlation between the number of ambient ultrafine particles and the RS activity, also probably due to nucleation events, which we have no good control over here. So to summarize these data then, the RS activity per cubic meter of ambient ultrafine particles can indeed vary widely, and depending on sources, seasonal events, episodes of natural gas to particle conversions possibly, and the RS activity of laboratory generated nanoparticles seems to be reasonably well predict acute in vivo responses. I didn't show you the data, but we have nice data to demonstrate that. The question is, how does it look like for chronic exposures? And for ambient ultrafine particles, this correlation still needs to be established here. And the RS activity of ambient ultrafine particles does not necessarily parallel their number of mass concentration, depending on what we need to find out. And final question, do results of epidemiological studies indicate an association between the ultrafine RS reactivity and effects, as we have shown in laboratory studies with animals for engineered nanoparticles? So these are still open questions here. Now, briefly, a few remarks on the position of ultrafine particles in the respiratory tract and their disposition here. And you see here on the left-hand side the 3 regions of the respiratory tract, the tracheo-nasopharyngeal, the tracheobronchial, and the alveolar region here. And on the right, the deposition efficiency for different size particles. On the left of the dashed line, the ultrafine particles. And you see very nicely that all regions here, all of these 3, are targeted, but to different degrees. For the very finest ultrafine particles, there's a high deposition by diffusion in the upper respiratory tract, and for the alveolar region here, that's a red curve. I don't think we have to leave the room here. And for the alveolar region is the red line. there is a very high deposition for particles, for nanoparticles, around 20 nanometer, about 50%. And that's according to the ICRP models of 1994 for nose-breathing humans. And so you see this throughout the respiratory tract fission deposition here. Now coming back to that high deposition in the alveolar region of 50%, we need to be careful how to interpret that, given that there's big differences in the surface areas of the different regions here. The tracheobronchial region on the left here has a relatively small surface area overall compared to the alveolar region here, which shows the terminal bronchioles, and then the acinos here with the alveolar sacs here, which is a huge surface area. So if you express then the deposition in terms of per unit surface area, the picture looks quite different. Here, this model for 20 nanometer particle here using a model, the so-called MPPD model here, comparing humans and rats, and you see in the extrathoracic, the upper respiratory tract, the nose has the highest deposition per surface area, followed then by the tracheobronchial region here, and then finally the alveolar region, the lowest here. And consider also that the scale here on the y-axis is a logarithmic scale. So very big differences. What you also see here, going to the alveolar region here, the deposition efficiency, and that's modeled for an 8-hour exposure here at 1 gram at 100 microgram per meter cube. It's a very small amount, 0.2 for the human and 0.7 for the rat nanograms per centimeter square. If you compare that to what you mostly seen in vitro studies, that is microgram per centimeter square and even more. So again, it points to what I said in the beginning, that we need to become realistic, and when we do these studies here, have a wide dose range, including the relevant human exposure range here. So we should also consider that in diseased respiratory tract, this may all change and will certainly change depending on the disease, depending on the degree of a disease here. With respect to the kinetics to translocation here, it is shown here schematically. So the blood seems to serve as a plenum from which many are distributed after inhalation into the respiratory tract to other organs. And that is certainly true that particles will be translocated to systemically via the blood, but also in part the lymph circulation is pointed out here to access then other target organs here. And one thing which we need to consider, that this is not a very fast and not a very strong process. The translocation rates are very, very low. And most of all, Wolfgang Kreiling has done a lot of data here and showed that once inhalation has been done, about maybe at the most 2% will be translocating into the body from the deposits in the lung. So it's not a huge amount, but if you consider a chronic continuous exposure, then it may accumulate depending on the kinetics in specific target organs, and then do cause some effects. Come back to that later again. So one thing I want to focus on a moment on is this neuronal translocation from the respiratory tract, from the upper respiratory tract into the central nervous system via the olfactory bulb. And this is schematically shown here, the anatomy. On the left, the correlation between the olfactory epithelium, the olfactory mucosa in the human nose, and the olfactory bulb at the base of the brain through the so-called cribriform plate connected by axons from the olfactory sensor neurons shown on the right here, which is of course a central nervous system neuron, but it's located outside the brain, outside the main central nervous system in the nasal olfactory epithelium here. And so the little cilia here at the outlet of the dendrites, and which may take up the particles. We don't know yet how that really works, but the location into the olfactory bulb has certainly been found And we did a simple experiment in rats where we occluded the right nostril of an animal and exposed this to 30 nanometer manganese oxide particles. And for 3 or 6, I think it was 6 hours in this case. And on the left side, it shows you the unexposed animals, the left and the right olfactory bulb. And since we had occluded the right nostril here, you see on the right side here, the exposed right nostril did not show any increase in the manganese oxide particles, whereas there was a significant increase on the left side here, demonstrating indeed the translocation along the nerve into the olfactory bulb. And in another study with manganese oxide here, this was a 12-day inhalation study with manganese oxide again, with both nostrils open. You see here also that manganese oxide, which is a known neurotoxicant, induced significant inflammatory responses in the brain, specifically the olfactory bulb on the left side here, the red bar, and also the TNF-alpha inflammatory protein increase itself on the right side here in the olfactory bulb in particular. So particles do get there depending on their chemistry, on their they will also can also induce some effects, and of course the dose plays a role as well as usual. A few words about hazard and risk characterization here, and start here with a risk assessment paradigm from the National Academy of Sciences here, which consists of 4 steps: hazard identification, to identify a hazard, and then to characterize the hazard here by exposure dose response data. And important, of course, is also to get some information about exposure. It's very, very important, exposure assessment. I know at this meeting here there will be talks about and have been talks about exposure assessment, and which is really needed for risk assessment. And then going on to risk calculation, risk characterization by doing some risk calculations before we then eventually can come up with some risk management decisions with respect to regulation and exposure standards, as shown in this overview here. So one thing we should also remember, that risk is not the same as a hazard, and that's oftentimes misunderstood here. So risk is a function of hazard and exposure. It's also not hazard times exposure. It's often said it's some unknown function between the two here. And so schematically shown in this 3-dimensional graph here, if there's a high hazard but no exposure, there is no risk, obviously, and vice versa. So keep that in mind, the risk not to mix up with hazard itself. When we do our toxicological assessment or testing, there are basically 3 pillars which we have to consider. One are in vitro exposures, then in vivo exposures, and then of course the correlation between in vivo human exposures here by extrapolating one to the other here. The key is here with in vitro exposures, what you can get is dose-response relationships, which is fine, but what is more important also is to really get the full range of exposure, dose-response relationships. And again, coming back to the risk assessment itself, we need the exposure data, we need the hazard data to do all of this here. And one approach here is what I call comparative hazard and risk characterization of inhaled nanoparticles based on subchronic, that is 3-month-long rat inhalation studies. And the key is here to have available some so-called, what I call benchmark materials here, positive and negative benchmark, against which the new nanomaterial to be tested can be compared. Based on an endpoint, the best is to use a quantifiable endpoint like lung rate or inflammatory responses that can be quantified. And of course, important as well is to get some idea about the retained lung burdens to again come up with exposure, dose, response relationships. And then you can express those by different metrics here, either simply by the mass, by the surface area, by the volume of the retained particles, or by the number. Then split up into comparative hazard ranking against your positive, negative benchmark, and comparative risk characterization to develop a subchronic safe, in quote, exposure level for the rats. And further on, then we need to attempt to extrapolate that to the human situation. And to do that, first a chronic exposure extrapolation for the rat, and then using dosimetric modeling as a first attempt to come up with a so-called human equivalent concentration before we then convert that or try to convert that into an occupational exposure level. So it's a lengthy procedure, and most of all, of course, a subchronic inhalation study to perform is very, very expensive, but I think at this point it's still needed to do that for particles that we are really interested in. And with respect to the extrapolation modeling, this is a very general scheme here from the rat on the left side. Know the exposure, experimental exposure. We know the inhaled dose, then we will measure hopefully the deposited dose and the retained dose, and then assume that the retained accumulated dose over a certain period should be equivalent in humans to cause the same effects, with of course an assumption which is not quite true. The rats might be more sensitive or less sensitive as humans. But then we can, again, with dosimetric models, determine what the human equivalent concentration is via deposited inhaled dose in humans to get to this HEC, human equivalent concentration. And then to get to the occupational exposure level, we have to use some assumptions with respect to safety factors or assessment factors to add on to the human equivalent concentration. So again, it's a complex process, but it can be done. This shows you only an example here of the differences in deposition efficiency between humans and rats for inhaled particles here. And it looks superficially pretty much the same for both species. But if you look closely, of course, there are significant differences in terms, for example, of the size of particles region, the alveolar region, here the red curve here, in humans up to about 10, maybe more particles, micrometer particles. In rats, it's at the most 5 micrometer particles getting there, but also the degree of deposition efficiencies is different between the two species. So this all is, I think, reasonably well caught in extrapolation, dosimetric extrapolation models using the MPPD model. And what we also need to consider then when we compare human and rats is differences in the biokinetics between these two species here. In rats, there's normally very little material getting into the interstitium here, whereas in humans, there's significant amounts of inhaled particles getting from the alveolar, not only again up the bronchial region via the mucociliary escalator, but also into the interstitium, where they form a compartment here, long-lasting compartment, and from where material is, with a very low retention half-time, moved to the lung-associated lymph nodes. So these differences certainly need also to be considered when we try to extrapolate from rat data to humans of inhaled particles here. This is a short summary of risk assessment approaches by different authors here. NIOSH came up with a recommended exposure level, REL, for inhaled multi-word nanotubes and nanofibers. And you see here it's 2 or 1 microgram per meter cube. Very, very low. Ashberger used a slightly different approach here, came up also with 2 and 1 microgram per meter cube for Loon. From Bayer, he came up with a much higher occupational exposure level of 50 microgram per meter cube. So you see there's a wide variation, and what we don't know for sure is which should be, these are all estimates here, how certain are those here. So there are certainly challenges. The NIOSH REL, recommended exposure level of 1 microgram, is that really distinguishable from background material? And should there also be one generic occupational exposure level for all? Are all carbon nanotubes and carbon nanofibers toxicologically of equal potency? Certainly not, as we know. Surface modification or functionalization, level of impurities, surface defects, they all are known to alter toxicity, as I pointed out at the beginning. But the problem is unless there are convincing data to the contrary, it is prudent to treat airborne CNTs and carbon nanofibers as hazardous. Desirable would be results of chronic rodent inhalation study. And that's interesting that such study has been started in Japan. And just a day before I left for this meeting here, I got a response from the PI of that study here, Dr. Fukushima, and he told me that the study, which had been finished about 3 or so months ago, the first results show that indeed with multi-volt carbon nanotubes, and these were the multi-volt carbon nanotube 7, the rats showed significant development of lung tumors, of cancer, at the low and mid, at the mid and high dose, not at the lowest dose. So indeed, if that would have been known to IARC, they probably would have labeled multi-volt carbon nanotubes number 7 as type 2A human carcinogen, probably carcinogenic to humans. So that's an interesting development, and we're looking forward to getting the final detailed publication of that particular paper here. So the outlook of toxicology of engineered nanomaterials here, acute in vitro and in vivo high exposure studies at irrelevant doses are useful for hazard identification and ranking. So I would never say they are not useful, but for hazard ID and ranking, yes, that's fine. Important though is repeat in vivo exposure studies, subchronic to chronic, and realistic doses are really needed for meaningful risk assessment. And very few chronic or subchronic studies are available at the moment here, and that's really a major gap in nanotoxicology. Furthermore, establishing positive and negative benchmarks is a useful approach to characterize new nanomaterials here, to categorize really. And a new research focus that is now coming up here, and that provides information on biotransformation processes at subcellular level to understand long-term fate of nanomaterials in tissues. Now, these very engineered nanoparticles, coming back to the ultrafine, ambient ultrafine particles here, there are several hypotheses how effects that have been found in epidemiological and in animal studies, what the mechanisms, underlying mechanisms might be here. So there are several ways. One is direct particle translocation, as shown here with the solid arrows here from the deposit in the respiratory tract causing effects. Although one needs to be careful to consider also what I mentioned before, that the doses are really low getting into extrapulmonary organs, but we should not, of course, discard this. Other is mediators induced by inflammatory processes leading to systemic inflammation, releasing other mediators, and also from the central nervous system, affecting the autonomic nervous system, which then in turn can affect heart events and cardiac events. So these are hypotheses, and people are looking at this and collecting data, which one might be the main underlying event for effects that have been seen and are still being seen in animals. Considering also, and that's my major concern, that they should be done at relevant dose levels, and for that, again, we need to come back to repeat exposures here. With respect to an ambient ultrafine particle standard, there are challenges, of course. The physical-chemical properties are, of course, very different for UFPs, elemental carbon, organic carbon compounds, inorganics, agglomeration, aggregation, and surface properties, and so also ultrafine sources, ultrafine particle sources are certainly all different and expected to cause different biological effects here. And concept of a PM 0.1 standard, a universal UFP standard, in my opinion, targeting all UFP based on any exposure metric may not make sense, because differences in the physical-chemical properties, so specific anthropogenic versus natural, give rise to significant differences in toxicity. And however, a standard could be really source specific based on the number concentration of the emitted ultrafine particles, and also considering that ultrafine particles down to less than 10 nanometer. I showed at the beginning the data that they really are existing. And so we need to identify sources that emit the most reactive ultrafine particles, and based on comparative hazard ID using proper dose metrics, and then regulate these sources rather than all ultrafine particles by introducing a number emission standard. And I think in Europe we are further advanced here and have those standards already for certain, I think for diesel exhaust, and it should be based on source-specific ultrafine particle risk assessment. Consideration of co-pollutants, particles as well as gases, of course, is also necessary as well. So, conclusion then, requirement for action for the emit ultrafine particle, toxicological and epidemiological studies provide increasing evidence that ultrafine particles are a major component of PM pollution, and they may causally contribute to adverse human health effects with respect to pulmonary inflammation, acute systemic inflammation, cardiovascular events, neurological effects, they all have been shown, and lung cancer too. And the IARC decision to categorize air pollution very broadly as human group 1 carcinogen should provide a strong justification for governments to regulate anthropogenic emissions more strictly. And ultrafines as one precursor for PM2 should be a main target. So this is the last part here. I don't know, how much time do I have still? Oh, okay. Then going to the last section here, in vivo or bioprocessing, through which we will gain new insights for subcellular fate of nanoparticles here. And we have recently started to do that in collaboration with Ushi Graham from University of Kentucky. And a study that we have here, that we have started and still continue with other materials here, are 4-week rat inhalation studies with silica nanoparticles. And the sub-project here is to use high resolution or even ultra high resolution transmission electron microscopy analysis of nanoscale breakdown, their dissolution and processing of silica particles in the phagolysosomes of alveolar macrophages. So it's really in vivo exposure then separating lung tissue, preparing it for this TM analysis. And here are the starting materials here, silica nanoparticles, spherical silica particles here. Shows very well the amorphous nature of these particles, and of course they are agglomerated. Indeed, they form really agglomerated aggregates as shown here in this picture here, and have very smooth surfaces without etching or dissolution. That is how the animals were exposed. And then this was a 4-week exposure, and 1 day after the 4-week exposure, you see in the lung section here, again, this is inside the macrophages, inside the phagolysosome of alveolar macrophages here. You show a silicon-rich halo surrounding the silica deposits here. And also there's some evidence of ferritin appearing here, the red circles as shown here, and clearly showing in vivo processing of these particles here with respect to dissolution to be started here. This is 27 days post-exposure here, and what you see here is that in vivo processed nanoparticles are really highly changed now with respect to dissolution and forming this cloud pattern here around the initial deposits. And again, at 27 days, this shows significant in vivo processing again here. They lost their original spherical shape morphology. They showed dissolution patterns very nicely, and even void and pore formations where particles had been before, and then an outwards growth of the silicon-rich halo we mentioned before, and EDS mapping. And this lung section of 27 post-exposure shows first the silicon and oxygen, as you would expect, overlapping here, but also some association with sulfur and phosphorus shown here, indicating maybe indeed new particles formed here with respect to phosphorus. We don't know yet for sure here, but what we also found is that there, if you separate it in 2 zones, the deposits here, there is the zone 1 with the dissolving precursor silica nanoparticles here, and then surrounding this precipitated ultra-small silica particles. They are less than 4 nanometer in size. And in fact, Dr. Graham has also found the same thing for Ceria particles which had been given by a different route of exposure, and that took much longer as for silica. But again, here too, the formation of secondary, very small particles, less than 4 nanometers, 3 nanometer area particles was found here. And it's not, we don't know yet sure what the exact chemistry is, and that's what we are going to find out further studies. So let me close then with, for this part here, investigating the in vivo bioprocessing of nanomaterials using ultra-high resolution imaging coupled with chemical analysis is essential to understand their chemical transformations in organelles and the resulting tissue responses. With that, I would like to close and thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you for that fascinating talk. I think one of the key points is having a meaningful dose. Right, we've got just over 10 minutes for questions, and there are two people who will, one at the bottom, one at the top, who have got microphones. So if you put your hand up and I'll choose someone at random, but please wait till the person with the microphone has got to you. So I'll start on the left here, please.
Thank you very much. Very enlightening. What would you say if we had a reliable, or I should say my name and affiliation, Urs Bottelsberger, apologize to Switzerland. If we had a reliable, simple, automatic measurement for ROS, would this be, let's say, comparable to a CPC? Would this be the better measure for air quality control in terms of regulation purposes than just a mere number concentration?
Yeah, I would almost think so, but we need to have more data here. It would be nice to have a continuously measured instrument to be able to do that in real time, obviously. That would be great. And before we have that, we really need some more data to look at the correlation between RS-inducing capacity and effects, first in animal studies and then trying also in epidemiological studies to prove that. And without having a directly measured instrument, it might be very difficult. As soon as you capture those particles, they may change already and start to do something. Yeah? So I think to have such instrumentation, and I think Dr. Hopke was planning to put one on the market, and that would be a wonderful thing to have.
Okay, thank you all. Another question, please. We'll go at the top. This Casper.
Gerhard Kasper, KIT.
Yeah.
Haven't seen you in 30 years.
Yeah.
It's wonderful for me. I have a question which I don't quite know how to formulate. To put it pointedly, are nanoparticles or particles nothing but vectors of surface area? In other words, are all the effects ultimately dissolution or molecular? How much evidence do you really have, or how much evidence are you aware of that these effects are particulate in nature?
Yeah, well, of course, Gerd, you are right that many of these nanoparticles are soluble or partly soluble. And that's why I could not get into all the details here. And that's why it is so important to look at the dissolution behavior of nanomaterials. And when you start, and that is part of the chemical characterization, I have that in my table also, the dissolution or solubility. And here's a difference also. Most of the people doing in vitro studies, they do a so-called solubility assay in a static system, which is not really getting you to dissolution. We have a dynamic dissolution system where we have a flow-through cell and can really follow the dissolution up to zero of that material. And that is what we need. So we, for example, if you take a TiO2, which is really very, very, very poorly soluble, you may also want to call it insoluble. And we know from TiO2, which is a very benign material in my view, like carbon black also, that long-term effect at high concentrations, I'm talking about long-term inhalation studies, induce also lung cancer with TiO2 and with carbon black. And it's clearly a particulate event, it has nothing to do with dissolution. But you're right, with many nanoparticles which are, which dissolve, even if it's slow dissolution, things may be different.
I think we do lack a lot of knowledge into solution rates for materials. There are very few studies with a collateral information about the dissolution contribution to the effect.
Yeah, but I can give you another example here. There's barium sulfate nanoparticles or particles in general, which have been considered as a category of what we call the PSP, poorly soluble particles of low cytotoxicity, based on some older studies here from different groups. And as it turned out now, in a new study that has just been finished, a 2-year inhalation study with barium sulfate nanoparticles, there was significant in vivo dissolution which could not be detected in vitro systems. And that was surprising for one thing. And the other thing, because of the high in vitro dissolution, and there's a recent paper by Conduro et al., they found initially there was not much happening in the lung with respect to barium sulfate exposed animals at a very, very high concentration. But then all of a sudden, after a year, apparently there were some saturation processes going on in the lung. There was a significant increase in effects, inflammation in the lung, and accumulation there too. So we have to that's why it is so difficult to rely too much on just acute studies. We need to know more about the long-term effects and the long-term processes that are ongoing. And that's why I think this in vivo bioprocessing is so important to use.
Actually, Pracinis at the back there, thanks.
Sotiris Pracinis from ETH Zurich. I enjoyed very much your presentation, especially the last part. However, I am puzzled because what is always important in the solution studies is not only the particles, but the environment also.
Oh, sure.
And
yes.
Especially when they are in organelles, the particles actually, they make certain effects on the organelles, and they may, let's assume, change even the surrounding pH. And if you have silica at low pH, it will dissolve like that. So the issue is, can you monitor the surrounding, how this happens? Otherwise, this kind of result is half the story, if I can say the word.
No, you're certainly right. And yes, we can do that. We will do that. And in fact, we go further than that. And you know about the so-called corona formation with proteins. Yeah? And we have, I think, with Dr. Graham's collaboration, we have also now the possibility to look in vivo. That's the key thing. This corona thing has been found so far just in vitro studies. Quite a bit studies have been published about that. So we will be able to in vivo then analyze the corona formation as well and look at the surrounding tissues, also surrounding what the particles are like, and getting some idea about the proteins that are on the particles, including also tissue reactions, chemistry that are happening there. Yes, we will be able to do that. We are just at the beginning, but it's a good point.
Any more questions? Oh, it's Roy Harrison. Just a minute, Roy.
Thanks. Roy Harrison, University of Birmingham. Some recent work shown the penetration of nanoparticles into cells. Do you think this is a very important mechanism of toxicity?
Oh, sure, yes. And I mean, that's when we looked at the phagolysosome. That means they have already entered the cells. I mean, don't only look into macrophages, but also other cells where particles have been penetrating. And indeed, that is an important mechanism. Again, a cautionary note here. Many of these studies are in vitro studies at concentrations, at doses that are completely out of this world. And that affects also how many will actually penetrate. Again, in vitro as well, you have a one-cell system, and there is no surrounding cell, so the particles have no choice but to enter that one cell, instead of in the organism where you have many competing ways to where the particles could go to. So these are all very important considerations and caution to be used with results of in vitro studies.
Another question, please. We're at the front.
Joseph Stone, Paul Scherrer Institute. When we discuss this air-liquid interface or cell experiments, what kind of cells do we need to take for a realistic presentation of the mechanism and the effects? and there's a cell lines, B's to B and so on, and now there are also redifferentiated cells coming up. What do you think about that?
Yeah. Well, that is certainly a question that the individual investigators have to resolve themselves. And there are models available. The epithelix model you may be familiar with, the mutual air model, where they have explants from human tracheas and from rats also now. And they are really quite similar, or almost the same as you would see in vivo in humans and in rats in terms of the composition of different cell types. And they are used in ALI systems. Others are just using then either primary cells or also cells that you can get from some professional vendors here. And I'm not sure. There are these E549 cells. I have a bit of a problem with using those in an air-liquid interface system. Even the human epithelial bronchial epithelial cells, I don't know. You have a single cell type there, and then you expose them in the ALI system, and you have to know exactly what you're doing. You have to characterize the exposure very well, which is oftentimes not done here, and also the retained doses very well before you make any conclusions. So I think all these ALI systems are very, very useful. I'm quite in favor of those, but how to interpret the data, again, you have to be critical, self-critical most of all, how you do that, yeah.
Okay,
I don't know if it answers your question, or we can talk more about it. Yeah.
Okay, we've got time for one last question, which is up at the back.
Alejandro Keller, University of Applied Sciences, Northwestern Switzerland. I was wondering if somebody is looking at the age of the subject, because we know, for instance, that proteins will affect differently adults than children than unborn child. Is some work in this field being done?
Yeah, there is specifically, at least here in Rochester, and also others do some work with the developing organisms, so exposure at a very young age in mice. And most recently, we have actually published a study of a neurotoxicologist, and where we found that exposure to concentrated amyloid ultrafine particles in young mice, newly born mice, directly causes ventriculomegaly, that means an enlargement of the brain ventricles, very similar to autism. And so we use that as a new model for looking into autism, autism being induced by potentially ambient particles, specifically ultrafine particles. So yes, age is certainly being considered. And the same thing, we had done in the past some studies in aged rats, and found there too that there seems to be a greater sensitivity in terms of circular vascular effects. But it's not, with respect to animal studies, it's not a main line of exposures by many people. There are some studies, I think Joel Schwartz in epidemiology at Harvard University, they looked at aging populations, also retired people, and also found effects there with respect to cognitive function. But I don't know, and I'm not that familiar with these studies, how representative they are. But it's certainly an important aspect, specifically, I think, for the young developing organism.
Okay, I think that buzzer is a key point to stop on. And can I thank the speaker, and can everybody join me in having a round of thanks, please, for Professor Oberstdorfer? Right, next we have a preview of the 2016 European Aerosol Conference. For those of you who've got a long memory, will recall that the last time the European Aerosol Conference was in France was in 1994. So over to Dennis.
Thank you. Just 10 minutes before the coffee break. I want to say a few words about the thinking on the European Aerosol Conference evolution inside the board of the European Aerosol Assembly. In fact, there is a discussion starting several years before, and we take form in the last year in the meeting in Busan. But why this discussion is, as far as you know, there is during 2014 and 2015, there is 2 conferences on aerosol technology. And it was considered as a fruitful initiative that has brought new attendance to the aerosol meeting. So, as what you want inside the board of European Aerosol Assembly is to reinforce the European Aerosol Conference and to facilitate the attendance of persons coming of new horizons. So, the main idea was not to jeopardize the aerosol technology component of the European Aerosol Conference. So at Busan, we have a committee was formed by myself, Denis Boulot, José Castillo, who is the chairman of the European Aerosol Assembly, and the working group speaker, Sabine Würsler. And we have to make suggestions. So before to have a more elaborate proposal, which is in discussion, we have, as organizer of the next conference, to make a proposal. This proposal was sent to the committee, and this is a kind of a first step on the evolution. So this is mainly the idea is to regroup the working group inside 5 thematics. So I don't want to go into details. It's only you have to see that mainly there is there is 5 thematics: aerosol technology, which include 3 working groups; atmospheric aerosol, which include 2 working groups; control and measurement technique, which include 3 working groups, and so on. And beside this, in addition, we have a special session with special topics, but this is familiar. So this is the idea, is to give more legibility to the contents of the European Aerosol Conference. So now, practical. The mandate, we hope that the website will open in the beginning of November this year, and you can see the address. This address is very familiar. It's always the same, only the date is changing. The abstract submission deadline is the end of February 2016. The abstract acceptance is the middle of May, and so on. And the conference is between 4 September to 9 of September. The price it's not officially, it's not still fixed, because we have to vote inside the bureau of Asfera, but the figure is rough, is the same of around what we pay in Milano for the 2015. So I keep to talk about a tour. For the people who don't know, a tour is along the Loire Valley. The Loire Valley is here, and Tours is here, and it's not far from Paris. It's situated in the center of France and easily accessible. So the Loire Valley, the nickname in French is le Jardin de France, Garden of France, with numerous castles. The access is, there is a small airport that you can pass by London, but the nice way is to come by train. From Charles de Gaulle, it takes 1 hour and a half, and you have a direct train coming from Charles de Gaulle to Tours, and you come also by a car. The conference venue is a conference center of Tours. The architect is Jean Louvel, which is who is Thomas Pritzker Prize winner in 2008. Is situated in the heart of the city, just opposite to the TGV railway station. In fact, the TGV railway station is here. So it's very close. It's 100 meters between the railway station and the conference venue. You have a large space for the poster session and the exhibition, and many hotels are located not far from the conference venue. So we have, at this time, we have 5 rooms. The main one is a 700 place, which is Auditorium Pierre de Ronsard. We have a small one, Auditorium Descartes, and we have 2 rooms of 160 seats and 1 room of 100 seats for parallel session. If we have many abstracts, there is a possibility to rent a room, complementary room. Oh, I skip this one. At the conference dinner is not still fixed also, but there is a good chance that we can organize a conference dinner in the old 45 farm at the late Middle Age. So the dinner is in this room, and you come by car, by bus, and if the weather is nice, we can have a drink outside of the bâtiment. So, if the beginning of the story of Leonardo da Vinci is in Milano, as you know. But if we want to know the end of the story of Leonardo da Vinci, you have to come in Tours and go to Clos Lucé. Clos Lucé is the last home of Leonardo da Vinci. In fact, Leonardo da Vinci, François I, King of France, was very admirative of Leonardo da Vinci. And he sponsored Leonardo da Vinci. He buy Le Clos Lucé for Leonardo, and he said, "Here, Leonard, you will be free to dream, to think, and to work." It's a dream for researcher. So, and you can see here, it's a painting from Ingres, and you see François I here and Leonardo. I think it's a legend. The legend says that Leonardo passed away in the arm of François I, but it's not sure that it is correctly historically. So I have to finish, and for accompanying guests, there is a lot of things to do. Visit of chateaux like Chenonceau here, Chambord here, Amboise. At Amboise is very Clos Lucé is in the town of Amboise with this very nice castle, and you can make numerous visits, and this kind of thing will be arranged. So don't forget to come to Tours, and I recall the website. It will be open in November. So thank you for your attention. And please.